Hey everyone, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. In today's video and in the next one, we're going to be exploring this. It's an absolutely fascinating topic, the uniqueness of the Bible. The Bible is really unlike any other literary work or book in this whole world. There's a very good reason why it is by far the most printed, published, translated, and read book in world history, and it owns the top place in each of those categories by a long shot, and really is never going to be dethroned from any of them. And it's all because of the Bible's uniqueness. So in these two videos, we're going to be using a quote to kind of serve as our outline as we go along. A quote that I've found really helpful when we are looking at the Bible's credentials. And as you can see on the screen, here's the quote. The unity and continuity of the Bible, its circulation, the history of its translation, its preservation, its accuracy of prophecy, and in particular, its impact and power in human hearts and lives all bear witness to one great truth, that the Bible is unique and unparalleled in the history of writing. This fact, worthy of more in-depth study, is stated to demonstrate that a trust in what the Bible says is not irrational or the result of any blind faith. Christian faith is based on fact. And in this video, we're going to be looking at the first three of these: the unity and continuity of the Bible, its circulation and the history of its translation, its preservation, and then in the next video, we'll be picking up with the accuracy of prophecy and its impact and power in human hearts and lives. So, looking at the first one, the unity and continuity of the Bible, I'd like for us to consider a quote that I read once from a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. There's actually two books, Evidence That Demands a Verdict and More Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I don't think that they're in print anymore, as you can probably tell. It looks like a little bit older book, but it is an absolutely awesome book. One of the greatest anthologies or collections of quotes and references to talk about the historical evidences of the Christian faith in a wide range of topics, dealing from the Bible itself to archaeology to the resurrection. It really does a great job. But the quote in particular that I would like to read for you is this. A representative of the great books of the Western world came to my house recruiting salesmen for their series. He spread out the chart of the great books of the Western world series. He spent 5 minutes talking to us about the great books of the Western world series, and we spent an hour and a half talking to him about the greatest book. I challenged him to take just 10 of the authors, all from one walk of life, one generation, one place, one time, one mood, one continent, one language, and just one controversial subject. And then he inserts here that the Bible speaks on hundreds of controversial subjects with harmony and agreement. And then I asked him, would they, that is, the authors, all agree? He paused and then replied, no. What would you have? I retorted. And immediately he said, a conglomeration. And so what he's saying here in this quote is this, that if you were to take just 10 of those authors and ask for their thoughts and opinions on a list of controversial subjects, and even if all those 10 authors came from the same walks of life and the same generation and place, that there might be some agreement at certain points along the way, but at many other points, they're going to disagree with each other. I mean, just for an illustration, take what's been going on right now at the time of this recording for the last couple of years, the subject of COVID-19. And you have people from similar walks of life who hold very different views across the spectrum on COVID itself. You have Republicans, conservative people who are cautious and maybe uncautious, whatever, and the same thing on the Democratic or left-leaning side. It really is interesting, and it's all over the board. And so there's definitely not a consensus in these things. Now, getting into the Bible, let's keep in mind that the Bible is a book that is written over a 1,600-year span. That's written over 60 generations, written by 40-plus authors from every walk of life, including kings, peasants, philosophers, fishermen, poets, statesmen, scholars, and so on. So a lot of different kinds of people, written in different places. I mean, Moses, he wrote out in the wilderness. Jeremiah, at times he was writing in a dungeon. The Apostle Paul was free at times, other times writing in prison walls. Luke, while he was traveling. John, while he was exiled on the island of Patmos. Others were writing during the rigors of a military campaign. And that leads to the next one, that they were written at different times. So David in times of war, Solomon times of peace. Different moods even. That some were writing during the heights of joy and the others writing from the depths of sorrow and despair. Also, they were written on 3 different continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. And so the cultural influences of each of those continents could come into play. And then even written in 3 different languages. The Old Testament mostly in Hebrew, a little bit of the later written books in Aramaic, and then also Greek in the New Testament. And each of those languages, and one thing you might learn one day with languages is that the language that we speak can help to shape and form our perspective and how we see the world around us. Now, the Bible contains not just one controversial subject, but really hundreds of controversial subjects. And if you're still wondering what a controversial subject is, it basically is one that would create opposing points of view and opinions whenever it's brought up. But those opposing opinions can happen even among people who were born and raised in the same community and who share similar views. And so, because you have all these authors of the Bible, about 40 of them, from very different walks of life and writing in different circumstances, from different perspectives at different times, etc., you would expect to see a wide range of opinions on these controversial subjects. And yet, what we see is a harmony and continuity from Genesis to Revelation, from the beginning to the end of the Bible. We see one unfolding story of God's redemption of man. To illustrate this a little bit more, let's just take one other religious work for a moment, the Quran, which, as you may know, the holy book of Islam or Muslims. Now keep in mind that the entire Quran was not written by a bunch of different people, but it was written by just one man in his own lifetime. And yet, in spite of that, there are a number of irreconcilable contradictions in it. One of them, the example of, when the Israelites, Moses parted the waters of the Red Sea and the Israelites went through and the Egyptian army tried to pursue them, the waters came crashing down on the Egyptian army. Well, that account is actually mentioned twice in the Quran. In one case, Pharaoh drowns with his troops. In the other case, Pharaoh survives. So, well, which one is it? You can't have both. They're mutually exclusive of each other. Also, in the Quran, there are factual errors. One of the Quran's claims is that Christians include Jesus' mother Mary as a part of the Trinity. And that to me just tells me that Muhammad wasn't doing his homework that carefully or was just getting his facts mixed up. But that leads to another point here about the Quran, that and this one I think is very intriguing, that Muhammad even inserted into the Quran, I believe it's the second surah, somewhere in there, or the second book. Surah is what they call a book, where it's a built-in fail-safe, that just in case if Muhammad, years later when he was writing, happened to accidentally contradict something that he had written previously. It's called the law of abrogation. And in short, the law of abrogation states that if anything that is written contradicts what was previously written, then what is written later really overrides and overrules or supersedes what was previously written. Now, I hope you find the humor in that, because, it really begs the questions that if Muslims are to believe that the Quran is the word of Allah, their God, why would somebody like God need to have a little law in there to cover mistakes if he can't get his facts straight? I mean, that just doesn't strike me as being very godlike. I mean, I don't envision God as somebody who would make mistakes like that. And so it begs the question, is the Quran really the infallible word of God, or just the fallible word of one man? Now, of course, this in and of itself does not prove the divine authorship or inspiration of the Bible, but as we shift our focus back into the Bible, it really, I think, does help us to pause and think. How is it possible that all of these book writers of the Bible, coming from radically different periods of history, social classes, walks of life, locations, and so on, all of them, how did they all share identical perspectives that did not contradict themselves? I mean, just think of the odds of that happening. I mean, there's no way that that could happen by accident. The odds are so small for it happening as to be really impossible, at least from a human standpoint. And so the best explanation for that is that this came about by a divine plan. That's all for part one. Let's get into the second part then, of the Bible's circulation and the history of its translation. Now, as I've already said, no other piece of literature comes close to rivaling the Bible in its circulation and translation. And if you don't know what circulation means, it really just has to do with how widely it has been shared around the world or circulated. Well, as of 2017, the complete Bible, Old and New Testament, had been translated into 670 languages, according to Wycliffe Global Alliance. And just the New Testament is available in 1,521 languages. According to Guinness World Records, between the years 1815 and 1975, around 5 billion copies of the Bible were printed. And that's not even accounting for the centuries before that, going all the way back to the time of Christ, and then the time of the Lutheran Reformation with the printing press of Johann Gutenberg, which radically sped up the copying and printing of the Bible. There's just no way to know or estimate how many Bibles have been printed throughout human history, but it's clear that it's been billions upon billions. And maybe not even just Bibles itself. Maybe they're just Bible passages found in commentaries or lectionaries, or even books like this one that incorporate a Bible passage or two. So anyway, looking at the image on the screen provided by United Bible Societies, this, I think, really demonstrates how widely circulated the Bible is amongst all the different continents of the world where people live. Now again, this in and of itself does not prove the divine authorship or the inspiration of the Bible, but it again is compelling circumstantial evidence that if we start with the assumption that God loves us and desires to be in a relationship with us, and assume that God wants to communicate with us, that it would make sense that he is going to ensure that his word is the most widely circulated and communicated word that there is. And that's what we have with the Bible. Moving on then to the final part for our consideration today, part number 3, the Bible's preservation. Now, some people like to argue that there really is no way that we can know for certain that what was originally written by the apostles and prophets has been faithfully transmitted, or that is passed down to us today. A Bible skeptic and an atheist named Bart Ehrman, who serves as the professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at the time of this recording, years ago now, wrote a best-selling book under a very provocative title called Misquoting Jesus. Now, in this book, he accuses the scribes who copied the New Testament through the centuries of accidental and even deliberate changes to the text. And he draws people in with this claim that there are between 200,000 and 400,000 variant readings or differences in these manuscripts in the New Testament. And now, to maybe someone like you, and to people who are unfamiliar with the field of textual criticism, Barth's case can seem rather compelling. In fact, maybe even you're thinking like, holy smokes! I mean, 200,000 to 400,000 differences? I mean, how can we, there's no way we could clean up that mess. How can we be certain, there's no way we can be certain that we have the original words of the Bible? Well, hold your horses, because really all Barth is doing here is just creating drama where there is none. Because those who are in the field of textual criticism recognize that really all that Barth is doing is just building a house of cards that quickly comes tumbling down upon a little bit further inspection. And also, maybe just as a side note before I continue and address those things that Barth brings up, when we read the works of negative Bible critics like Barth, I think that it helps us to keep in mind, at least in the back of our minds, the possibility that the author might have an agenda against Christianity or an axe to grind against the Christian faith. And when you dig a little bit more into Barth's life and history, you can see that Barth definitely has an axe, and he grinds it quite well. Now, getting to Barth's claims, contrary to what he says, none of the differences in the New Testament manuscripts affects one Bible doctrine or teaching that hasn't been clearly settled by the rest of Scripture. And as for those 200,000 to 400,000 textual variants in the New Testament, the overwhelming majority of those differences boil down to a couple of things. One, spelling mistakes. And second of all, the addition or the omission of a definite article, the word the. And you probably didn't think that those would be considered textual variants, but they are. And you could tell that those problems are easily resolved with just an ounce of common sense. Or when you maybe compare those manuscripts with the errors with other manuscripts that don't have those errors, you can see, okay, what is actually supposed to be said. Because a little something about how the New Testament text was copied throughout the centuries. Sometimes you did have somebody who was actually in possession of a hard copy of the copy, etc. And they used that copy, then they looked at that copy and wrote things down. Other times, though, what you would have would be a reader dictating to a room full of scribes sitting at their desks, who would then copy out what the teacher or lecturer, dictator would say. So if I were to tell you right now to write down Jonah walked the puppy to the dog store, you would write that out. Now, what might happen is you might miss a word in there at some point along the way if I were to keep talking, or you might mistakenly misspell a word because, well, people don't always know how to spell things properly, do they? And so that's how some of those errors could pop up. But getting back to the point, scholars across the theological spectrum say that in all the essentials, not in every particular, but in the essentials, our New Testament manuscripts that we have today go back to the original words. And Ehrman is really just a small, very small minority, or part of a very small minority of textual critics who say what he says. And so in other words, most people don't agree with him in his field of work, and there's very good reason for that. But still, maybe a question then is popping up in your heads regarding all these copies. Well, to prevent all this doubt and speculation and skepticism and even cynicism in Barth's case, why didn't God preserve the original copies of the New Testament? Well, if you look at church history, I think there's some very good reasons for that. If you go just back to the medieval age, Christianity had really become infected with superstition and the veneration and worship of relics. In fact, one Christian has sarcastically said that enough pieces of Jesus' cross have been found to build the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California, because this place said, oh, we have the wood from the cross of Christ, and this place said the same thing. And about some time after that, another 2,000 places said, oh, we've got wood from the cross of Christ. And you put it all together, and okay, that's a pretty big honking cross. So probably they're not all, or if any of them, likely came from the cross of Christ. And so, given that happened over the years, it's probably a good thing that God did not preserve the original hard copies of the New Testament, because he didn't want them to become a sort of idol where people actually worshiped those pages of Scripture. Now, there are two other things that I would like to mention about the preservation of the New Testament. A couple of really fascinating things. It'll take a little bit to explain it fully, so please bear with me, and we'll have a video in here, but well worth it. The first of all is the volume, or the size, the number of manuscripts. In the following diagram here on the screen, you can see yellow circles that represent the number of copies of ancient manuscripts that we possess from different works of antiquity. And you might even recognize some of the names there, like the Greek poet Homer, or the philosophers Plato and Aristotle. You might even recognize Julius Caesar, who was the first Roman emperor, and why all the emperors were named Caesar. He makes an appearance here in this chart. But keep in mind now that none of the works of these individuals that we have today is the original copy. All we have are copies, or copies of copies, from that ancient history that has been preserved and passed down to us today. And taking a look at the circle by Homer, what we have of Homer's works is actually quite impressive. I mean, there are 643 ancient copies of Homer's works, but from there, it quickly goes downhill, as you can see, that only 7 ancient copies of Plato's works have survived, 49 copies of Aristotle's, 10 of Caesar's, and when you look at most of those works of antiquity, you really have only about 10 or a dozen or so copies, ancient copies, that have survived to this day. Now, compare that to the New Testament. There are another 10,000, what the diagram says, 24,000 copies out there of the New Testament, whether it's complete copies of the New Testament, individual books, fragments, Bible passages used in commentaries or lectionaries, etc. And in fact, this diagram is even a little bit outdated. Since the time this diagram came out, I've heard that number now stands at anywhere between 25 and 30,000. More than 5,700 Greek copies of the New Testament, another 10,000 copies in Latin, and then there's the other languages as well, like Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, and so on. But the volume, meaning the number of ancient copies of the New Testament, is just, it's absolutely incredible when it's stacked up against the other works of antiquity. It's like taking the earth and comparing it to the sun. Or at best, with Homer, maybe Jupiter with the sun. Either way, the sun just much more massive. And that sort of paper trail through the centuries helps us to figure out what the original manuscripts actually said. And also equally impressive then is the second point to make here. And that is the time interval between the original and the earliest surviving copy. Now, for instance, the earliest surviving copy of the works of Julius Caesar was written about 1,000 years after the original was written. For Homer's work, that time interval stands at a reasonable 500 years, and I say reasonable very loosely. But for most of these, that time interval is about 1,000 years or more. Now, why is that significant? Well, what it means is that from when the original was written, that during those years in between, we cannot trace the transmission of the copies. So in other words, we can't see what was happening through the centuries as these manuscripts were copied and copied and copied and then passed down. So we can't see when or where any variants or errors may have crept into the copies. And yet historians actually all agree that what we have of these works today is a faithful copying of the originals. Well, if you're going to have that same understanding, you should operate in the same manner then with the Bible. However, when we compare that whole time interval thing with the New Testament, we see something really incredible. Because if you look on the chart, the time interval between when the original books of the New Testament were written to the oldest surviving copy of the original is not 1,000 years. It's not even 500 years. It's just 40 to 70 years. Just no more than 2 to 4 generations. And I don't know if I have the copyright here, but this book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, it was copyrighted in 1972, which from the time of this recording means that it is 50 years old, this book right here. So older than the time interval between when, say, John, the Gospel of John was written to when the earliest copy of John has been passed down to us. We're going to watch a video now at this point, a little bit longer of one, and we're going to be in the video hearing from a lawyer and a Christian apologist named Abdu Murray. And he's going to be responding to a number of poorly thought out and researched objections that an unbeliever has regarding the gospel accounts of Jesus' ministry. Now, unfortunately, Abdu doesn't have enough time to respond to every objection that this guy raises and answer every one of them. And there are answers to them, and some of them actually are quite easily answered. But I think that what he tells us, he sticks to the more pertinent ones, and what he tells us is pretty fascinating about those original manuscripts of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, he talks quite fast, so I encourage you to pay close attention, and hopefully you're able to follow along. So let's watch the video.
So how am I supposed to believe in the truth, the validity of Jesus in the Bible when we have no writings from Jesus himself? There's decades, if not up to 100-year period, where we have no writings from anybody else about Jesus when there were lesser supposed gods performing miracles, which they did write down. And then when you finally get to an account of Jesus, the Gospels, you have conflicting stories. Just quick example, when they go to the tomb and they roll the stone off, one, there's an earthquake and angels appear. The other one, that doesn't happen. One, there's Mary there. The other one, she's not. So they're not like small discrepancies like Jesus was wearing a red shirt or a blue shirt. We don't have any real evidence from Jesus during his lifetime. And then hundreds of years later, we're supposed to believe these conflicting reports. How am I supposed to reconcile that? Thank you.
Thanks for that. That's a shotgun of a lot of objections there. I don't want to necessarily discount any one of them by not being able to answer all of them. Obviously, with a time constraint, we have to make sure that we go to the more pungent ones you've actually mentioned. I think you're just factually wrong about the disparity between the times of the writings in Jesus' life. For example, when you look at actually the manuscript evidence, now we have what many scholars, one scholar in particular, probably one of the world's finest biblical manuscript scholars, says is an embarrassment of riches. In fact, most people, Gospel of John, good example, Gospel of John is the last gospel written. No one disputes that. Many thought it was written in the 200s AD, long after Jesus' death. And so there was all this presumption about how Gospel of John is theological, it's legendary embellishment, there's no possible way this could actually record the life of Jesus. Obviously, it's just someone's theological reflection after the church gets established. But then they find this little postage stamp sized fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 18. In fact, the very verses Robbie quoted when he talks to Pilate and he says, "Whoever's on the side of truth listens to me," is on this little fragment. The fragment itself is dated between 90 AD and 125 or 150 AD. That's the fragment. And it's a copy of a copy of a copy. Now, of course, as you know, copies come after originals. That's kind of how it works. So if the fragment of the Gospel of John, the very last gospel written, is a copy of a copy of a copy, and that's written between 90 and 125 or maybe 150 AD, that means the originals are even earlier than John. Now, if John is the last gospel written, and Luke and Matthew are written prior to him, then that means that they are written prior to 90 AD or so. They draw, in fact, Acts is a book that's a sequel to Luke. So if you follow the sequence backwards, you have John, not written in the 200s, easily written within the first century. Then you have Luke and Acts is the sequel to Luke. What's interesting about Luke is you look at what Gospel Luke records. Amongst the manuscript evidence, there's great evidence for the early dating of Luke. But you look at what it records, and it actually follows in not the Gospel of Luke, sorry, the book of Acts, which Luke wrote. It records the life and times of essentially the apostles after Jesus' ascension. It focuses particularly on Paul. It talks about his shipwrecks, talks about his whippings, talks about his beatings, talks about his persecutions. You know what it leaves out? His death. Conspicuously absent is his death. We know when he died, AD 64. He was beheaded by the emperor. So what does that tell you about when Acts was written? If Luke left out the single most important event to culminate Paul's ministry, then we have to assume, at least it's reasonable to assume, that Luke was written before AD 64. Sorry, Acts was written before AD 64. If Acts was written before AD 64, and Acts is the sequel to Luke, that means Luke was probably written in the 50s. If Luke was written after Mark, that means Mark was written in the 50s or in the 40s. Jesus dies in 33. So it's definitely not hundreds of years later, not even close. We're finding earlier and earlier manuscripts. In fact, one scholar friend of mine said this about the accuracy of what the Bible actually records. He's a biblical scholar, a prestigious guy. He does a lot of writing, a lot of speaking. He says, you know what archaeologists do when they go to look in the ancient world, in the Middle East, to find out where thus and such or this thing is? The first book they look at is the Bible. Secular archaeologists look at it. So we have this, I think, an impressive corpus of material that's very early dated to the time of Jesus. And it's written, I think, by eyewitnesses. And there's great reasons to believe why either they are written by eyewitnesses or they contain the accounts of eyewitnesses. A great book you might be interested in reading, maybe you've already read it, but if you haven't, I would recommend it to your reading, is a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. Richard Bauckham has forgotten more about ancient history than any of us will ever learn. And he talks about the eyewitness account. Mark's gospel is actually the transcription of Peter's testimony, his firsthand account of what I saw. Gospel of John is rife with eyewitness accounts. And you'll go through and you'll see all these things. So you see these eyewitness accounts that are written by the people who were actually there. And then one of the things that I think is amazing, I'm a trial lawyer, so evidence matters to me. I understand how evidence works. We have a thing called the Hearsay Rule. The Hearsay Rule says that out-of-court statements can't be admissible in court if they're being used to prove the truth of the matter asserted by the statement. That's a convoluted way to say we don't trust out-of-court statements that we can't cross-examine in court. There are a number of exceptions to the Hearsay Rule. Some say it's more whole than cheese, but the Hearsay Rule has exceptions. One of those exceptions is a statement against interest or an admission by an opponent. In other words, somebody who's on the other side of a case who says something that admits the weakness of his own case and the strength of yours. So you might say, well, all those eyewitness accounts were written by Christians. Well, it'd be weird if you saw the risen Christ and didn't become one. It'd be kind of strange. But what would you like to have as an eyewitness? You'd like to have an enemy of the Christian faith who thought it was wrong and was ready to stamp it out and suddenly become a Christian. That's exactly who Paul is. If I were in a trial and I had a witness like Paul, who was once my enemy but is now on my side of an issue, you put that guy on the stand and you let him sing his song to the jury over and over and over again because he's willing to change his mind, and it cost him something, and that gives him credibility. That's why we have exceptions to the Hearsay Rule for these kinds of things. Early dating of the Gospels, the reliability of the Gospels, as but one example, even the Old Testament has a lot of these things as well. Then you have the credibility of the eyewitnesses themselves. Even hardened skeptics, Bart Ehrman, for example, will tell you this idea that we have no evidence for Jesus until hundreds and hundreds of years later, that is bunk. He went on the Atheist Guy radio show, and the Atheist Guy radio show host tried to say, well, we know that Jesus is just possibly a legend because there's not real evidence. And Bart Ehrman, who's not a Christian, who's an atheist, said, oh, that's not true. The guy says, well, you know what I mean. It's like, no, you can't be irresponsible like that. You have to point out there is strong evidence that Jesus existed and that he died by crucifixion for his claims to be the Messiah. And there's pretty good evidence for a resurrection, though I don't believe in it. So you see all that stuff. I say, that's why I would say to trust him. There's great evidence. I think, for the historicity of the Gospels, and there's great evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And they're all preserved in this little booklet that stood the test of time for 2,000 years. It's not like scholars haven't been poking at it. They've been poking at it for quite some time. But the presumptions of later dating have actually been sent to the flames by a little postage stamp as but one example of the manuscript evidence that's available for the Bible. So what I would say to you is, why should you trust it? I'd say because it's proven itself trustworthy. There's a healthy skepticism in your question, and I appreciate it. I think it's the right way to look at things. Why should I trust it? The question you have to ask yourself, and I have to ask myself, I'm not singling you out, I think everybody in this room has to ask. You can ask the question two ways. Why should I trust the Bible? Or, why should I trust the Bible? There's questions with the exact same wording, but I think different views on it. There's a skeptic who is somebody who believes something, who won't believe something until there's enough evidence. It's just natural. And then there's a cynic who doesn't believe even when there is. And I would suggest to you, take that skeptical view and look at the evidence, and I think it'll actually answer your question of why. Thank you so much for your question.
So I hope that you were able to follow along with that, because every time I watch that video, I'm just fascinated by what we learn about the Bible. It's just amazing that we have these existing copies of the New Testament that were made just within a generation or two after the originals were written. And that means a lot of things for us. It means, first of all, we have hard evidence that the gospel accounts of Jesus' life and his ministry were written within the lifetime of the people who saw those events take place. Now that removes the possibility that the authors could have embellished the stories, because there are plenty of eyewitnesses here that were still alive and then could have called them out for lying. And what I mean by that is this. Take the feeding of the 5,000. All four gospel accounts tell how Jesus fed 5,000 men plus women and children with just a couple of fish and pieces of bread. Now, this miracle wasn't, it wasn't something that was done in secret. The Bible claims that a lot of people saw that it happened. Now, if this didn't happen as the Gospels, or in the way that the Gospel writers say that it did, there are plenty of people alive who could have said, you know what, you Christians are a bunch of storytellers and liars. And it would have absolutely wrecked the credibility of the Christian faith, and nobody would have believed it. That's not what happened. In fact, what we find from ancient history is that there are no records of people challenging or disagreeing with what the Gospels all say about Jesus. And that's just because there were too many eyewitnesses. And in fact, even sources that were hostile to the Christian faith, like the Jewish Talmud, actually admit that Jesus did supernatural things. Now, of course, they call what Jesus did sorcery, meaning supernatural acts that get their powers from below, from the devil, and not miracles that come from God. But still, they acknowledge that those sorts of things happen. Now, second of all, this small time interval between the originals and the earliest copies removes the possibility that any sort of legendary elements crept into the story. Now, legendary elements are various additions that usually get added into a text, 1 to 200 years after the events they are describing allegedly took place. A legendary element would be something like an outrageous claim, such as a person rising from the dead. Well, as you know, the Christian faith is centered on the outrageous claim of Jesus rising from the dead. The difference, though, is that the historical records clearly show that this teaching was already around a few years after Jesus was crucified. And that is far too short of a time period for those resurrection claims of the New Testament to be considered a legendary element of the story. Third, having such a large volume of manuscripts dating back to within, let's say, 200 to even 300 years of the originals really helps to give us supreme confidence that not only did they report historical truths, but that we are able to determine beyond a reasonable doubt what the original writings actually said. And there have been some excellent illustrations and workshops and examples to show how all this works and how we can be confident that what we have is the original, but I don't have the time to share that with you now, so I can talk with you more about that if you wish at some other point in time. But anyway, that's just the New Testament. Then you got the Old Testament, which really is an entirely different animal in the whole regard, the field of textual criticism. Because unlike the New Testament, the Old Testament has very, very few ancient copies of it. In fact, the oldest surviving complete copy of the Hebrew Old Testament was written in the year 916 AD, or about 1,300 years after the last book of the Old Testament was completed. And so we reasonably might begin then to suspect that with that such a large time interval, that errors or legendary elements could have popped up into the text during that period of time. However, there are some other details to consider that really, I think, show us that, okay, those concerns are not warranted. The first of all is how the ancient Jews preserved the Old Testament. I mean, they did it like nobody else has ever done it. They kept tabs on every letter, syllable, word, and paragraph on a portion of a scroll, counting the number of times each one occurred. They were by far the most anal copyists in human history. They would not burn a retired manuscript until they were confident that the new one was a faithful copy of the old. And that sort of discipline gives us confidence that even the text from 916 AD is a faithful copy. But wait, there's more, as the old pitchman Billy Mays would once say on TV. And the first thing here, in two regards, two things of interest. The first one is the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, which was written in about the 3rd century BC. When we compare the 916 AD Hebrew text to the ancient copies of the Septuagint that are actually dated back to before the time of Christ, we find that the Hebrew text is very close to what is written in the translation of the Septuagint. Now, the other piece of evidence is what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you may have heard of them before. But in 1947 at the caves of Qumran, in the picture of the cave there on the screen, you see I actually got to stand from right around that position where that picture was taken once, back in 2018. But a number of canopic jars, that is jars that were pressure sealed to preserve the documents inside, were discovered in these caves. Now these writings were written before 100 BC, so over 1,000 years older than that 916 AD Hebrew text. But one of the scrolls was a complete copy of the Hebrew text of the book of Isaiah. Now the most popular chapter of Isaiah's book, undoubtedly for Christians, is chapter 53, where we hear that prophecy about Jesus, that he would be pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, and so on. But when we compare the Isaiah scroll found at Qumran with the 916 AD book of Isaiah, we find that the 916 AD book has only 17 letters difference or in question. 10 of those letters are just a matter of spelling. 4 more letters are minor stylistic changes, such as conjunctions, and the remaining 3 letters spell the word light, which is added in verse 11, and doesn't affect the meaning greatly. But furthermore, when you look at the Septuagint from back then, that word light is supported. And so what we have then is that over 1,000 years difference between these two scrolls, and yet there's only a 1-word difference. I mean, that's incredible. Now, much more could be said about the Hebrew copyists and their practices that would really help us to see, okay, they did their job right. But this, I think, is enough to give you an idea of how faithful these men were in their work. Now, again, does this prove the divine authorship or inspiration of the Bible? In and of itself, no. But it does demonstrate that the scriptures have been faithfully preserved to this day, and it adds to that list of strong circumstantial evidence that is quickly piling up that this book is like no other book and that it's worthy of our consideration. All right, Like I said, there's going to be a couple more points to be made regarding the uniqueness of the Bible, but we'll be saving that for the next video. So again, thanks for your time and for filling out the worksheet, and we'll see you in class. God bless.